Hello and welcome to ChatDPS, where this week you're going to or I can expect, a fairly spicy conversation if the preamble is anything to go by. The one thing I am a little bit concerned about is the fact that I don't appear to have my Realms of Cyber shirt, which is obviously dress code of the week. So yeah, concerned. Responses on a postcard. This week, we're tackling the thorny issue about data sovereignty and how that's actually developed into sovereign products. And we're seeing already that both Switzerland and France have started developing their own. Lots of murmurings out of the Netherlands at the moment. And we've even seen in Estonia the fact that they've set up an agreement in Luxembourg for them to host their data many miles away from the Russian border. So data sovereignty is getting hot, and for many different reasons. First and foremost, I'd like to take your perspective on things, Robert, just to sort of like say, what's the importance of sovereign data or actually hosting your data locally or whatever to begin with? And why do you think this has actually developed into, this position where certain nations are actually developing their own products as well to go alongside that?
That's a nice softball question to start off with, Nick.
I thought I'd pass it to you.
That's super complicated, and I suppose if I was going to try and work through that, I'd be sort of thinking about you've got different sets of regulations, laws, standards per jurisdiction, and I think probably the biggest issue for most organizations that are non-US based is how much reliance there is on the US, and generally what you see is, in particular, a lot of division between what's happening in the EU and what's happening in the US. And the EU, as we know from some of their regulations like GDPR and what they've done around AI, for example, they're pretty tough on how data is collected, managed, controlled, processed. And so they've got some pretty strict regulations around that, and they enforce that pretty firmly. And we've seen some pretty significant cases coming out of breaches of EU laws focused on US companies because the US companies have a much lighter touch when it comes to regulation, shall we say. And so we see a lot of discussion around this, and I guess ultimately it's down to which sort of side you sort of lean on. Do you lean on the side of protecting individuals' data and holding organizations accountable for the data that they hold on behalf of individuals, personal information, sensitive information, and the like? Do you hold organizations accountable for the guardrails that they put in place, whether it's in relation to data that's held or in relation to something like implementation of AI? So there are a lot of differing, as I say, laws, standards. And I think what we're starting to see in the last couple of years is a shift, I would say, where particularly in Europe, there's concerns around over-reliance on US-based platforms and products. And so you've sort of touched on a little bit, I think, some of the movement away from the US. I was just talking before we started recording about President Macron in France announcing that all government agencies by 2027 will be moving away from Microsoft products. I think Teams was mentioned, but I think they're looking at other products as well. So they're trying to break that reliance on the US. And why is that? It's because, as I say, there's a much lighter touch on regulation, and there's concerns about, let's say, government access to that data once it's held on US servers and how that might be used. And so there's a real mismatch between what Europe does and what the US is doing. And so that's data sovereignty comes up, but also sovereignty around applications and products. And I think that's the new thing. And then couple that with, we've seen major hyperscalers go down in the last 6 months. I think each of the major hyperscalers has gone down for one reason or another. Sometimes it's just DNS, and sometimes maybe it's other errors. But it just shows how dependent.
DNS,
yeah,
Robert.
there we go.
It's
always DNS. I know. It's always DNS. But I suppose it sort of it helps promote that discussion about, are we over reliant on US based applications? But also it should prompt a question. Call it a governance question. Call it a due diligence question about, where is my data going? So some of that data might be going to your on-prem or your cloud-based data center locally. Maybe it's going to the US, but maybe you've got an application like Salesforce or ServiceNow, where is that data going? Maybe some of it's going to your local data center, maybe some of it's going to the US, or it's going to the Netherlands, or it's going to Singapore. And so you need to be able to understand where that information is going and have appropriate controls in place to the extent that you can. But obviously that's very difficult. And it's a real challenge to nail down these big SaaS providers. And just to give it, as I keep rambling, just to give another example, one of the airlines tried to sue CrowdStrike over the issue they had.
Successful.
No, because they exclude everything when it comes to their terms. So that as far as I'm aware, that application didn't get up. You've got some real challenges dealing with US companies. So
Yeah.
while there's a real rush to implement AI agents or implement AI or whatever it might be, whatever the next hot topic is, I think that there should also be some discussion about like not just data sovereignty, application sovereignty, but just really understanding which vendors am I working with and where is that information flowing, and can I have better control over that? Is that a risk for my business if there is some sort of data breach, or even if there's an operational issue where that particular application I'm relying on goes down? How do I maintain my operations if I'm relying on these overseas-based companies? So there's a really long rambling answer to that question, but I'm happy for us to go into that in more detail.
Thanks for putting some thoughts out there to begin with, because it's quite clearly a contentious issue across many different borders, across many different legislations, across all these things. Adam Cunningham, from a technical perspective, what are some of the challenges around this, do you think?
There's an awful lot. So first of all, I think, to quote Robert from a couple of episodes ago, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
You should.
I think is very important in this case. I think one of the biggest issues that we have is what happens if you lose your data and it's not within the country, and what data do you have that's of value? So understanding the data you have, understanding the value of the data, and then understanding if you actually need to worry about sovereignty because of it. If it has anything to do with IP, if it's anything to do with regulation, like privacy, those type of things, like financial, all these type of things, you need to start worrying about your borders. When it comes to basic life and basic questions, like a lot of people use AI for really basic tasks like rewording emails, all of those type of things. Who cares? Doesn't matter where it is at that point. But if you're starting to look up like legal information and you're starting to create things, that's when you have to go, okay, what am I going to do with this? Where is the data? What happens if that data is exposed? And the biggest tip that I can give anybody in this world is, if you're uncomfortable by the answer to that question, don't do it.
Right. It's an interesting one. So, Adam, it sounds to me like, people have been using key management for years, right? And obviously the lazy man's version of that is to go, oh, well, I'm buying my cloud services from, XYZ American company or whatever it is. I may as well buy my key management from there as well, which is like, why? but is it lazy or is it ignorance? I don't really know. But surely we can cover some of this off with having a key management solution to some of that problem, so people can carry on hosting in the cloud, but we can do key management, surely.
And it's not just the key management as well. It's like, oh, we can do the caching and we can do web application firewall. And I don't know how many conversations we have where it's like, what are you doing about security in the cloud? 3-letter acronym company has that, or alphabet company has that covered. And you're like, nah, pretty sure that's not the case. So there is absolutely this movement now. Look, we were speaking about this in the preamble, like I'm from the pre-discussion. I was the one who was guilty of saying, all you're doing is pointing at data needs to be sovereign, you're creating this big headache. Just classify your data and make sure that that's the stuff that's kept sovereign. Now, that was a very long time ago. And I think that my thinking has evolved along with the way that technology's evolved and the way that regulation and also bloody good sense has evolved. It's time for business to catch up, and we're seeing that charge being led by European Union countries. They're seeing that charge. There's new regulations around privacy data in India, and that's very. It's very interesting, but it's also extremely important, because how many organizations actually run out of a large consulting firm that has thousands of people that operates out of India, because it's a cheaper way of us doing business. But then we have to have a look at, well, how's that going to impact things? Because now we're looking at, well, all this data is being processed over in India or companies out of European Union or out of the Australasian region or out of the US. We've seen examples of an extremely efficient executive. And when they looked at the logins, it turned out that the logins were at like 16 consecutive logins. And it was an outsource of every single bit of his work to, I believe it was a Malaysian outsourcing outfit.
Ooh.
And it just turned out he could not be that efficient. And what was he actually doing? Because every single part of his job was being done by virtual assistants. So we're going to see a lot of that stuff is harder to do. So, I'm sure, Adam, you're, from a cybersecurity perspective, you and I generally speak from the same hymn sheet when it comes to dumb shit that people do in cybersecurity. And to repeat again, just because you could doesn't mean you can, doesn't mean you should. So it's, I just think it's going to be very interesting because, we saw recently about 2 weeks ago in Switzerland, they said, we're no longer going to be supporting Palantir. And if you look at what Palantir does, like that's surveillance software and, you're getting your surveillance information from a non-sovereign offering.
Right.
We just have to be careful we don't swing too far the other side because right now we, based here in Australia, we don't have a sovereign antivirus offering, or we don't have a sovereign web application firewall offering. We don't have a sovereign capability for anything on the hardware side. But what we do have is we do have very strong regulations around the way that we handle data and the way that we prepare around cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, and especially the way that we use Office. Essential 8 comes to mind, and the way we use Office products. So I think that step one, if we break it down, if step one, we look at the regulation and look what's available to us, then we do those things well first. And in the meantime, look at ways that we can keep our data safe and in sovereign environments rather than relying on everything going offshore.
Right. Okay. So this comes back to that old Scott Farquhar quote from the press club a little while back, which is let's move at the pace of technology rather than the pace of bureaucracy. And the opportunity there for us is that, we can start looking at solutions to that particular problem by hosting the data and doing smart things around that. Is that what I'm hearing, Robert? Do you think?
Yes. So picking up on what the others have said, I think the word maturity comes to mind in two senses. Maturity in the sense of, like if we look at Australia and what Adam Green just said, there are no really good alternatives in a lot of these different sectors when it comes to native sovereign products, tools. So there's lack of maturity within Australia for alternatives. And then I think the other sense of maturity is 95% of organizations, probably more, don't even care about this sort of thing, aren't even thinking about it because it's way too complicated. So you've got to have a really mature organization that can actually go, you know what, I'm going to do all of this data classification. I'm going to work out all of my information flows around the globe. And I'm actually going to pick certain products. I'm going to understand what products I actually need to keep onshore or which data needs to be kept onshore and which data I'm happy to send offshore. That's really mature level of thinking to actually get to that point. And I would say 95% plus of organizations, let's focus on Australia, will just more than happily say, you know what, I'm all in with Microsoft. Just stick it all in with them. Give me whatever you've got. And I don't want to have to worry about this. So I think that's probably the biggest thing to think about is how do you actually persuade somebody of the value of actually going, and maybe you need to think about hosting this information in this sovereign data center or using these native or sovereign applications and tools and that sort of thing. So I think that's really critical to how you move this thing forward. And so it's interesting to see some government agencies, particularly Europe, do something different. But they're government agencies, so they've got a little bit more time and resources to be looking at these things. Whereas most SMEs, this is way beyond them.
So that.
All right, Robert, are you suggesting that a large majority of organizations are saying, "Oh, stuff it! I already spend all this money on Microsoft"? Perish your thought. You serious?
I know.
What?
Incredible, but true.
The term "Fox, can you tell me how the hens are?" comes to mind.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
Yeah.
But it's true. But to pick up on the point you were saying just before, like there is a silver lining, and things do look bright for sovereign capability in Australia. We do actually have quite a few really, really solid sovereign data center offerings in Australia. And that's where the stuff's hosted, right? And, we've got NV1 cleared stuff with Canberra Data Center as an example. And we've got sovereign cloud offerings if organizations want to go down the sovereign cloud path. And now you look, we've got a new submarine cable has just been connected up in the Sunshine Coast. So we now have greater capability and greater throughput available to us so that we can now start to stretch the boundary a little bit further. I know all about the I know all about the submarine cable in the Sunshine Coast because Jocelyn Kang is constantly posting about it and showing like pictures of the ship that's coming and connecting it up and everything. So it's very exciting stuff.
Yeah.
But, that's something that we've been waiting for to be able to connect us to the rest of the world, which is oddly able to give us a greater capability to push greater sovereignty on our side as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's your point about sort of sovereign cloud capabilities here in Australia already. Starting with the government and then tilting down. I mean, Macquarie Technology Group have been doing that really well, and working with government agencies for a number of years now. And I mean, one lives in hope of the fact that that's actually going to start being absorbed by the corporate community at some point because it has to mean something, right? So, I mean, again, I'm looking back at legislation. So we're thinking that the legislation needs to reflect that. We need to make the legislation clearer. We want it.
So let me talk to that. Because there was a point. I'm gonna disagree with. I think Adam Green talked about having strong regulation here. We've certainly introduced quite a bit of it, but whether it's fit for purpose and whether it's being enforced properly is another thing. So you can sort of talk about security of critical infrastructure, for example, and a great idea, and certainly it's definitely a step in the right direction. But just to take an example, 000 fell over last year. How embarrassing is that? So you can have the regulations, but if you're not actually making sure that these organizations are doing what they should be doing and actually have the robust governance and systems and everything in place, then what's the point of the regulation? And then
it's even more embarrassing to find out when they said we don't actually monitor that service, and we're like, this is a critical service to our nation. And it took, what was it, 17 hours, 19 hours before someone identified that it was down?
Yeah.
And it was a shame that it had just been picked up by a new provider when that happened.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And look, not to beat the crap out of Optus, but when you go back to their data breach, you had legislation in place, and one of the criticisms was that the legislation didn't do anything to actually help either prevent or then afterwards actually help with the recovery of the Optus data breach. And so the government, one of the knee-jerk reactions of the government was to try and tighten the regulations to actually go, well, we don't want what happened with Optus and then Medibank happening again, so let's tighten the regulations. Yes, it's good to have them. They're a step in the right direction, but they're not very effective. The only positive that I'm seeing at the moment is we're starting to see enforcement in some sectors. But just to touch on another one, Privacy Act, we've been talking about GDPR type provisions coming here for years and years and years. But basically, the Privacy Act is the same as it was 20 years ago, and it hasn't been updated properly since then. So we've got a long way to go.
Privacy's changed a hell of a lot in that time too.
We are eons behind Europe when it comes to things like that.
We have said this a few times, Robert, though, here that compliance doesn't mean safe or secure, right? So it's important to note that that's not a thing. The one other thing on this that I would like to say is Australia is an interesting one for sovereign capability. It's a country that's so large and has so much area that has nothing in it that having good network infrastructure around the country to have a similar level of service isn't easy to get in our current system, in our current climate. So that there's a number of flow-on effects that need to change for us to be self-sufficient in that area. Sorry.
Yeah.
Didn't one of our governments win the election based on a promise that they were going to fix that problem?
Well, you've got to hope, haven't you? I mean, but obviously other things came up.
Promises.
And then like that, I'm sure that was a very, very long time ago, and we're still, we're still having there was NBN stands for no bloody network, because it's still not reliable. Like we still don't have. I once did a tech roadshow with NBN, and I started it off with we'll talk about advanced persistent threats. It's something you don't need to worry about. It's all in the name. Advanced means, it's coming from nation states. It's coming from organized crime. Persistent means you always need a network connection, and therein lies why you don't have to worry about it. Let's move on.
Wow.
Half the room got it and thought it was hilarious. The other half of the room wanted to lynch me. But yeah, but no, not to pick on anyone in particular. I just think, to Adam's point, we actually do have a fairly challenging topography and a very challenging, very large space to cover on the perimeter of, and we don't use anything on the inside because it's either red or uninhabitable. So we tend to have, or it's flooding or it's on fire. Like we have a very challenging environment to work in. So I jest and make jokes about service delivery, but it is actually something that needs to be factored in. To Robert's point, you can't force a fire hose of regulation down people's throats, because if you increase the barrier of entry, then you get a lot more throwing of the hands in the air and going, let's just do what we can do. And then to Adam's point, we start doing stuff that's unsafe, and I'll beg for forgiveness later. So there needs to be more assistance from both industry and the government to help uplift SMEs, so that we can get SMEs to the point where they're actually able to protect or be in a protected state, and then they can start to look at sovereign capability, because you can bet your bottom dollar that it's going to be, if we price going for this versus going sovereign, there's going to be a magnitude of cost higher going sovereign, because we're an expensive country to live in.
We are an expensive country to live in, and obviously we don't want to be suggesting for 1 second that we want to be increasing the burden of entry.
Correct.
On that note, I think it's a really, really good time to draw it in. I think this is a conversation that we're going to have again. By the sound of it, there's some good points in there, and I think some good pointers. So on that basis, thank you, Adam Cunningham. Thank you, Adam Green. Thank you, Robert, for joining me again, and look forward to catching up with you again very soon. That was ChatDPS, and this is Nick signing off. Thank you very much.
Bye.